recent times, it seems we risk becoming normalised to wars dominating our headlines. The Ukraine-Russia war continues, the Israel-Palestine war constantly threatens to spill into wider regional conflict, and the brutality of other conflicts, like in Sudan, rage on. I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and to discuss the context of global conflict, the UK's role and its future, I'm here with former Commander of the UK Joint Forces Command, Sir Richard Barrons. Sir Richard has served in Northern Ireland, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, and has recently issued stark warnings to the West on the possibility of a Russian victory in Ukraine. Sir Richard, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Sir Richard, your army career started in 1977 and you completed your tenure as Commander of Joint Forces Command in 2016. What changes did you see globally and in the UK's global position in that time?
So it now feels like we've gone full circle. The first 10 years of my military service were in the Cold War, when the UK as part of NATO faced the existential threat posed by the Soviet Union of the day and its allies. And that finished in 1989, and then the bulk of my military service was then dominated by this really odd period in British history where we were not dealing with existential risk. No one was threatening to invade the country or crush it, and we were a long way away from any thought of a civil war. So the wars or conflicts I took part in, and you mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan and the Balkans, were of a particular type, and they're often referred to as discretionary. They were away matches, they occurred in other people's countries, they didn't affect the homeland, it didn't require the mobilisation of civil society, and they were largely prosecuted by a quite small set of regular forces on operations against enemies that were not peer. That didn't mean that they weren't serious, but in most cases they didn't have effective air forces or artillery or navies or missiles. And it was mostly about counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency. And the UK and its partners could decide to do these operations or not do them, and to stop them when they felt they'd had enough or success was proving elusive, as it clearly did. And that period has now ended. And we now live in an era where we've returned to dealing with the existential risk of great power confrontation and potentially that turning into conflict, and the symptoms of that are clearly evident in Ukraine, in Gaza, and also in the emerging discussion with China about how the world is going to work. So sometimes I feel I was, as a soldier, it was too late for the Second World War and too early for the third one.
Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but with hindsight, were we naive during those times, particularly following the fall of the Soviet Union, in Russia's intentions, imperial intentions, as it now seems to be?
So I think you can accuse some people of being naive, and mostly I think there are people who've never read any history, because it was a noble and worthy thing to want to believe in the early 1990s that Europe in particular had somehow grown out of war, had gone post-conflict, and we need never trouble ourselves with that kind of thing again. And that was amplified by the early onset of the digital age, and this sense that warfare would only be about some cyber activity and a bit of furious tweeting, and that we wouldn't exchange shot and shell. That was not a view shared in the rest of the world, not something you could find in history, and not something you could find in robust military analysis. But it was seductive, and there was a time, and the UK took full advantage of this in the 1990s, when we could stop spending quite so much money on defence, because why would you when you weren't faced with a deep peril, and spend more money on the things that we like health and education and filling in potholes. And that worked well until about 2008 and the financial crisis, which then made that really hard to afford. And it's taken us to this really odd position now, I think almost unique in our history, but it maybe feels a bit like the 1930s, where if we take our armed forces, they're at the bottom of a cycle of reductions and hollowing out for good reasons during the post-Cold War era. So they're in a state that we've ended up with for a different time, and now we're returning to dealing with existential peril. So there's a long way to go. And secondly, that's occurring when our economy is not growing and we want to spend money. We've got used to spending our money on other things. So making the hard choices to spend money on defence in a democracy like the UK, proving really difficult. Making those decisions in places like Russia and China, not nearly so difficult. Russia spending 6% of GDP this year and rearming at pace. And then I think there's some other challenges. One is in the post-Cold War era, our national politics is mostly about a battle over small things for the centre ground. A big consensus about what sort of public services we want, and we would like more of them, we'd like to pay less tax. That's all very natural. But our politicians have become mostly folk who know about running the margin. And they're not really up for electoral suicide, where they can talk about big, hard issues that mean changing the pattern of how we live and the things we spend our money on because they feel no one's going to vote for them, and they're probably right. But what we need is politics, I'm going to use this term rather glibly, at the level of statesmanship that's able to look at a really hard, unfortunate, unrequested situation and do something about it. And there isn't a whole lot of evidence of that. And then there is civil society itself. It's grown very comfortable. Some people describe where we live now as the age of decadence. We've got used to being safe and prosperous and comfortable, and we've developed a preference for talking about things that are quite luxurious if you live in a part of the world where you're starving and you're freezing, and everyone will have their own list. But the world we're now in means that we're going to have to reset resilience at the level of a citizen, an institution, a government, and in a whole of society effort. And you can see countries like Sweden and Finland already doing this. They call it total defence. And yet in the UK, our standing national idea is that conflict is exclusively something for a really rather small set of regular armed forces and shouldn't trouble anybody else. If you look at the experience of Ukraine, we're reminded that war between states with the future of your state at risk is a whole of society undertaking. It's not something even primarily for the armed forces.
Are democracies then fundamentally crippled in meeting the challenges that this new dangerous world presents?
So I think we need to recognise democracies flourish more easily in calmer waters when things are going well. And when democracies have to make hard decisions, the electoral challenge is you need politicians to say we need to do something that's really difficult that will make your life less comfortable or less prosperous. And that isn't a vote winner. And that probably doesn't work until civil society stands up and says, hang on, we feel really in peril now, we demand that you do something about it. And that only occurs when something terrible has happened. So democracies have the huge advantage of being innately resilient because we all have a stake in it, we all have a voice, and we identify our future as a part of this democratic collective outcome. But we take a while to get there, and it generally means that something terrible happens and we then, in the way that we did in the Second World War and arguably in the First World War, pick ourselves up out of the ashes. But in the world we live in now, the ashes might be quite deep and the picking out might be quite hard. And autocracies have the advantage of being directed. So if a confrontation between states needs all levers of power, so the armed forces, what governments can do and what the private sector does, that's an easy thing to orchestrate in Russia or China, even if it's frankly a bit clunky because it's centralised and often not terribly competent. But they can be more organised, but they're also more brittle because if life gets really difficult, then people in autocracies feel they don't have a stake or their leaders are taking them in the wrong direction, then they may choose to challenge why they have that particular form of government or that particular form of leader. And that may come when they are really sorely pressed. And at the minute, neither Russia nor China are anywhere near having that sort of conversation.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council. And to discuss the context of global conflict, the UK's role and its future, I'm here with former Commander of the UK Joint Forces Command, Sir Richard Barrons. I want to come back to Russia and China a bit later on, but just talking about democratic elected officials' decisions, you served both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which have played their role on the sort of the domestic political dialogue front. Let's talk about Afghanistan first. Was the current situation where we've left and there's a resurgent Taliban, was that predictable? Was it inevitable? Did it take you by surprise?
So it was entirely predictable, and it was predicted, but nobody predicted it would be as rapid or quite as chaotic as the way that it actually occurred. And as you said, with hindsight, you can look back on these things and understand them rather better. And the first problem with the engagement in Afghanistan was the thing we were trying to do, which was to try, after a while of having dealt with Al-Qaeda, to give Afghanistan an opportunity to lead its life really very differently. And the truth of that is it's going to take a really long time, and it's going to take a really huge amount of money, and nobody wanted to devote that much time or find that much money. And we should also recognise that we made it hard for ourselves, and we were in denial of this for some of the time, but not at the end, that we were partnered with an Afghan government which many people in Afghanistan saw as the problem, because their representatives at local and regional level and even national level were so corrupt and behaved so badly that the population just saw us partnered with the people that they thought were the problem. Whereas the Taliban, locally grown, were not the easiest partners, but they were more tolerable, they were Afghan, and their terms were easier. And then we made it harder by saying that we were going to eradicate the staple income for most families in southern Afghanistan, poppy, without setting out how we were going to replace that income. And then, of course, we were foreign and for the most part, we were Christian. So for all of those reasons, this was a really hard sell. And the truth of it is, we were never going to be there for long enough. We were never going to spend all the treasure needed to do that. And we found ways of diminishing the consent of quite a lot of the Afghan people. Having said that, certainly in pockets, and I would cite a lot of the British effort in Helmand, we really did make a difference. We did create a local opportunity, but we couldn't make it stick. And then in terms of the exit, well, it was largely done by a calendar, and a calendar set mostly by US politics. We understand that because I was one of the first into Afghanistan in 2001, and as the MOD Ops Director, as a 3-star general, I was an important part of the machine taking us out of combat in 2014, and subsequently we saw the debacle that followed. And the fact is, we said, and it was clear, that if we did not leave behind a sufficiently resilient Afghan state able to preserve its own security and to deliver better services to its people, it was very likely not to survive. And it didn't survive, and it didn't survive at a pace that nobody really foresaw. But that's because our Afghan partners in the field looked over their shoulder and they saw their leadership evaporating. And why would you fight if there was only you standing in the front line? And that brings us today, where ISKP is established in Afghanistan and taking terrorism to Russia, to countries in Europe, and no doubt it'll come to the UK in due course. The TTP, the Taliban that's focused on India, is established in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is established in Afghanistan. And the thing that we went in to stop, a safe haven for terrorism that could bring harm to our shores, is now resurrecting in Afghanistan. And that is clearly not a success.
I'm going to ask a slightly personal question. That must be quite hard to look back on, considering all the work that went into it and the lives that were sacrificed in doing that. Is that a very difficult part of any military role?
So I actually personally don't find it that difficult, because when I and many people like me were there doing our jobs, we were doing our jobs to our best of our ability, and we could see we were making a difference. The fact that the Afghans didn't take up the opportunity, or that our countries decided to stop giving them that opportunity, I understand. I have Afghan friends to whom I feel I owe some sort of an obligation, and I have only ever disappointed them. But that's, I suppose, a personal thing. The one bit I really am mournful about is the fact that terrorism has returned to a safe haven in Afghanistan, and we are going to have to think hard what we do about it. It just can't be ignored.
How did the withdrawal from Afghanistan affect the UK and the West's reputation globally? Did it have an impact?
I think it's had a huge impact. I think in the region of Afghanistan, it has affirmed the opinion of many that countries like the UK turn up every generation or 2 generations, promise a lot, make no difference and leave a big mess behind them. And there's no enthusiasm for that to happen again. So this has harmed our relationship with Pakistan and I guess India. It has opened an opportunity for Russia and China, they after all are in the neighbourhood, to assert themselves over a place that we said that we really wanted to help and then didn't do very much in the long term. But the bigger harm is in that chaotic extraction where the West was made to look foolish by the Taliban, and where we made pledges to people who had worked with us, we'd get them out and then left them behind. It has absolutely, I think, informed how Russia thought about its next step in invading Ukraine, the thing we saw manifest in February 2022. And I guess it's also informed how China thinks about how it slowly and gradually calibrates its advance regionally and in the world. And that's a long-winded way of saying it created the impression that the West, for all its power and history and military might, does not have the stomach to stand up for the not only its interests abroad, but even its interests at home. And if that's the case, then other powers in the world will feel that they can advance their interests in Asia, Africa, even in Europe, without the risk of us getting in their way. And that has to be undone.
Was the West starting from, and I use the term West very broadly, starting from a difficult position, given that the Iraq war in 2003 disrupted the region and seems to have had absolutely catastrophic consequences?
So the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 and everything that followed did take the eye off Afghanistan. And I mean, that's absolutely clear that there was then not enough effort in Afghanistan to sustain what had been quite a strong start. It allowed the Taliban to do 2 things. One, to regenerate. And we should recognise that the Taliban as an insurgency had a safe haven in very remote parts of Pakistan. So it's really hard to fight an insurgency when it's got a border it can pop over to winter in safety. But the fact is the Taliban returned to strength in Afghanistan, partly because there wasn't an alternative force or collection of resources to stop it, and partly because the Afghan government with whom we remained partnered didn't show the improvement. In fact, it continued to prey on its people in some ways. So the reason there was a Taliban insurgency was a lot of people were fed up with the government that we had installed when we chucked the Taliban out in 2001. But the fact is, even from a military perspective, there were some years in the first decade of this century where the British Armed Forces, particularly the Army, were doing the thing that they were told they would never do, which is they were sustaining campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan at the maximum sustainable level, which is about a large brigade in each place on a permanent basis. In fact, the whole of the British Army was essentially in a hopper and rotated every 2 years through a role in one or other theatre. And neither theatre, well, they were different, but neither theatre was it easy to show that you were going to succeed, no matter how long you stayed. But it was also really hard to see how you could stop.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and to discuss the context of global conflict, the UK's role and its future, I'm here with former Commander of the UK Joint Forces Command, Sir Richard Barrons. You suggested earlier that we showed ourselves to be weak and disorganised, and Russia and China noticed that and calibrated their place in the world and their response on that. You've been recently quite outspoken about the possibility of a Russian victory in Ukraine. Where are we with that now? What is the possibility of a Russian victory, and what does that mean? And what should the West do to respond?
I think the first point to recognise is the fact that Russia felt it could invade Ukraine in the way that it did in February 22 is a massive failure of deterrence on the part of the West. We, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, we did not collectively enable Ukraine to deter a renewal of the Russian invasion. And Russia clearly felt that if it did invade Ukraine, there would be howls of protest from the West, but there would not be a substantive response, a lesson they drew from the response to the invasion of Crimea in 2014. So everything that's happened since February 2022 has been an emergency response to our failure to deter. And that emergency response has gone through two phases. The first phase, in the wake of the invasion, which was long seen coming, was about supporting Ukraine with things we had on the shelf or could find in the world, so ammunition and equipment and training advice, in an emergency response to what turned out, fortunately, to be a deeply flawed Russian initial invasion. And that led to Ukraine taking territory back at the end of 2022, which created a sense that Russia was easily going to be pushed out. And then we went into this second phase, which was last year, where we saw the almost complete failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive for reasons which are well understood. That the fact is the Ukrainian forces were never big enough or good enough or could endure long enough, that's about ammunition and logistics, to smash their way through what had become a formidable set of Russian defences, textbook and heavily invested in. And when you go on the offensive, you look for an advantage of about 5-1 over your opponent, and Ukraine never got closer than about parity. And the second thing that changed last year is that we ran out of things on the shelf. And then we entered this phase where the war in Ukraine is about industrial mobilization by both parties. And the situation we're in now is our own fault, because it's the result of things that Russia has done. Russia has mobilized its armed forces. It's not short of people. It's recruiting to 85% of its target. It is short of ammunition, but it's still got 5 times as much artillery ammunition on any given day as Ukraine. And it's got help from North Korea and Iran. And it's refurbishing a massive amount of ancient equipment that it has in its warehouses. So it has a personnel and a material advantage. It also sniffs a diminishing will in Ukraine to keep going with the fight because of the human costs and the material costs that comes with it. And then Russia saw two things to its great advantage. It saw the debate in the US about the 60 billion arms package, which was delayed, I think, for 6 or 7 months. It's now been approved. And it saw the European Union saying it would deliver 1 million artillery rounds and then delivering about a half by March this year. So the speed with which Russia has learned and reorganized and is rearming, and the equal and opposite dilatory response in the West to give Ukraine the ammunition and equipment that it needs, has created a moment of vulnerability, which we're living with right now in Ukraine, where we are relying on Russian inefficiency or lack of training or incompetence to not break through what are quite stretched Ukrainian lines, although they are getting more people and they're now going to get the ammunition that comes with this US package. Our hope is it's just enough, just in time. That is a ridiculous way to fight a war, as if you were keen on some sort of score draw. And it's ridiculous because for the West's own security, clearly the most efficient, most assured way of preserving our security is to make sure Russia does not smash Ukraine. And although the judgment on balance is that the Russian assaults we're seeing today around Kharkiv and maybe a bit further around to the north, and I think their main effort remains further to the south in the Donbass. So although we're seeing Russia making ground in 3 places, people are saying, who observe this very closely, they don't have the strength to break through and they don't have the strength to fight their way and occupy a city like Kharkiv. On the other hand, they are getting close, and once the artillery gets within 25 kilometres of Kharkiv, like Kherson, might become a very difficult place to live in. And this is not the place we should be. And we should recognise that if our assumptions are wrong and Russia, by dint of effort or just luck on the battlefield, does break through, well, the day that happens and Russian forces are moving towards the Dnieper River and there aren't many Ukrainian forces in the way, President Zelensky will be demanding the no-fly zone from the West that he asked for at the start, and NATO states that border Ukraine will be mobilising their forces as a precaution, and they'll be suggesting that NATO might like to help. And in there are enormous risks of escalation and miscalculation, which aren't to anyone's benefit. And you can be sure at that point, President Putin will again raise the spectre of tactical nuclear weapons. All of that is avoidable if we just give Ukraine enough weapons and ammunition to break up the Russian attacks. And I come back to these ratios. Ukraine is pretty good in defence because it can manage a Russian advantage of even 5-1, but not in ammunition. It needs all the stuff to break up Russian attacks. And if you take the attack on Kherson in the north, because we don't allow, well, most countries don't allow Ukraine to fire the ammunition that they give them into Russia, Russia is able to organise its attack in perfect peace and harmony, just 30 miles from Kherson, and it's only when it crosses the border and is essentially in action that Ukraine can fire American ammunition at it. That you can't fight a war like that unless someone has given you lots more stuff, and we really haven't. So we have to find the way now of making sure the line in Ukraine holds in 2023. To 24, to 25, to 26, it doesn't matter how long it takes. And then there's an entirely separate debate about what would Ukraine need in order to go on the offensive. And the rough answer is about 3 times as much as it needs to defend, assuming Ukraine has the will to do that. So in our own interests, Ukraine has to hold the line in 2024. And then we need to help them hold the line for as long as this comes to some sort of resolution, because all the alternatives are worse.
What do you make of the possibility of a Trump presidency and its impact on the West's ability to hold Russia back through Ukraine?
So the first thing is we should recognise that the US has been saying for more than 10 years that it is no longer willing to pay the bill for European security. So the US stumps up about 70% of the cost of the NATO if you lump in the entire US defence budget into NATO spending. And that made some sense in 1947 when NATO was formed, when Europe was on its knees. But today the European economy, including the UK, is about $17.5 trillion a year GDP, and the US is about $23.5 trillion a year GDP. So it's entirely reasonable for US politicians to say they can't explain to their own voters and taxpayers why they're paying quite so much for European security when America's primary concern is in Asia Pacific and the rise of China and that difficult conversation, when it has major problems on its border and a national debt approaching 100% of a US GDP. So whatever the outcome of the US election in November this year, the US is going to pay less for European security. So that just adds to the bill of Europe standing up for its own defence in the face of a difficult Russia. I think what this election will determine is the pace and scale of that change. So with Mr. Trump, it might be really dramatic. With Mr. Biden, it might be more measured, but it still might be quite painful. And if Mr. Trump were in power today, and that 60 billion never made it, there is no way that Europe can make up the difference in 2024 into early 2025. And what Europe has to do now is, recognising that the stakes are high, is galvanise its own defence industry so that should the US step away or do much less, that Europe can pick up the slack, because this is primarily a matter of European security. And it takes about a year to build a factory that makes artillery ammunition. It takes about 2 years to ramp up production of complicated missiles and things like armoured vehicles if you've got to start from scratch. So Europe has had time to make these adjustments. It has not done so. It's starting to do it. And now, in the best interest of the whole of Europe, now we need to get a move on so that we can dictate the outcome of the war in Ukraine and not rely on the incompetence of our opposition.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and to discuss the context of global conflict, the UK's role and its future, I'm here with former Commander of the UK Joint Forces Command, Sir Richard Barrons. We've talked about Russia, Ukraine and Afghanistan, but of course we are the Conservative Middle East Council, and what is quite striking, and I welcome your thoughts on this, is that when you talk about the West-Russia tensions and conflict in the Middle East, when you're standing there, there's some confusion and there's some bewilderment as to why the West is so down on Russia. It's a very, very different perspective because, of course, a lot of our allies in the Middle East also have a relationship with Russia. So the alliances for our security in Europe aren't as clear-cut with our allies in the Middle East as might be, and that's been seen in the UN Security Council votes. What impact do you think the other major conflict that's ongoing as we speak in Israel, Gaza, Israel-Palestine, is having on the Middle East's perception of the West and the UK, accusations of double standards, whether that accusation is justified or not, and a movement towards a kind of bipolar world where you have the BRICS countries on one, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, then NATO and the West on the other, and the Middle East moving towards the BRICS global South element. Is that a fair assessment, and what do you think?
So I think it's an enormous mess. The things I'm pretty sure about are that we are already in a world where there are two big camps, the Liberal Democrats led by the US, including much of Europe, but clearly not all of it, and the autocratic capitalists led by China, but with Russia in the van in Europe and in many ways also in the Middle East. And that is a debate about how the world is going to work. And if we had this sense after 1945 that there was the rules-based international order, which was essentially attuned to institutions and ways of working that the liberal democracies favoured on the back of the Second World War, and you can see that in the IMF and in how the UN works. Well, that's gone now, and we're now having a conversation about how is the world going to work, because countries like China and Russia and India and Iran, they have their own view about how it works. And these differences, in some cases, are quite small. In some cases, they're pretty profound. And a great deal of the world, and I think that includes much of the Middle East, but definitely in Africa and parts of Asia, they're looking at this and wondering if they need to choose. And if they do have to choose, it's not obvious to them in the 21st century that they would choose the fading West over the rising Asian power, because they seem to have more money and they seem to want to use that money with fewer strings. And the old confidence of a single superpower, the US, has clearly evaporated. And then I think there is this question of trust in the West. So we talked about the disastrous exit from Afghanistan, and that clearly raises eyebrows about, well, are the West only ever anywhere for their own benefit? You can see the failure to support Ukraine sufficiently, and indeed, as you've described, many people think that what happens to at least eastern Ukraine is not really very interesting, and the whole world can't be expected to take an interest, and indeed really isn't taking an interest. And now we have the disastrous situation that's occurred in Gaza over the last 7 or 8 months, and that has clearly led to many people in the world questioning why Israel is supported in the way that it is at such enormous expense to the Palestinian population of Gaza. And then there are episodes such as the large-scale Iranian missile attack on Israel, where the US and the UK helped to get in the way of it, and yet in Ukraine none of that occurs, and the circumstances are clearly different. And the challenge, I think, that's harder in and around Gaza is that everybody knows that it is inconceivable that the Israeli military can destroy Hamas in the sense of that word. They can severely deplete it. They can surely deter it from doing anything like the horrible things it did on the 7th of October last year. But you can't kill an idea, and Hamas can melt away and regenerate and just be annoying at a deadly level, as it is already in northern Gaza. And yet Israel has embarked on a mission to destroy Hamas, even though it knows that that can't be, quote, a total victory. And the cost of doing that has been astonishing in humanitarian terms. There's no dispute about that. And it's not over yet. And despite that cost, there is absolutely no sense at all about what a good outcome is from this. What is the strategic outcome of all this horror that means the Middle East is a better place, a more balanced place? And left to the extremists on either side, then we would have a regional war because they seem to really want one, and we would be in the territory of ethnic cleansing. So let's all cleave to the centre ground here, but find a sensible way through it. And I was observing just yesterday where there are sensible conversations about well, you've got to get the IDF out of Gaza in some fashion, and that was going to need a third party. Well, we've seen that in my career in many, many places. It's not easy, but it's doable. But what's characterising this is almost nobody is volunteering to do it. Well, that isn't going to be good enough. So, again, in everybody's interest, there has to be a way through this morass in Gaza that delivers a stable, strategic and better outcome, so we don't simply do it again. Because as things stand, it's just going to keep going on.
Would that third party need to be an Arab state? Does the West have any credibility left to be able to play a role in that?
So everyone, as usual, is saying the US needs to be there, and the US clearly isn't going to be there. Its support for Israel has been so profound that it would really struggle to be seen as a neutral third party. It can still deliver a lot of political clout and money. A third party military force would have to be good enough to stand in the face of the IDF, because they're going to have their own clear views about what should happen, even if they've left Gaza, and stand in the face of Hamas and other organisations that won't have evaporated but clearly can't regenerate and take charge, because that simply isn't going to work. And stand in the face of others like the Palestinian Authority that clearly lack credibility and capability. So you're going to have to be quite choosy about how a third party intervention, including military force, is led, managed, resourced, and there's going to be a premium on capability and competence. So where do you normally go for that? You normally go to Europe. And so there are European commanders, headquarters and forces that are capable of providing that sort of intervention. They know how to do that, and they come with more or less historical baggage, and I would argue sometimes you have to park that. But then amongst the Arab states who would be more welcome in that setting, there's a real mix of competence, and I gather powerful countries like Saudi are not keen, and powerful countries like UAE may be more amenable to it. But we shouldn't just focus on the military dimension of this, because a military third-party intervention can do a useful thing, stabilise the security situation, make the shooting stop, separate the warring parties. But that is just on the path to something else, which is like a political solution. So what is that political solution? And who is going to be the figure in the way that someone like Carl Bildt was way back in the 1990s in Bosnia? A politician able to navigate a difficult path, both on the ground with the parties, but more particularly bringing together a divided international community. So it's that political leadership you need to get right before you start investing in a military intervention, I think.
I'm going to finish by an observation and then a very, very broad question. I have noticed since October the 7th and Hamas's terror attack on Israel and what's happened subsequently, it has been very hard to mention the word Ukraine to Middle Eastern diplomats. They don't want to know. They say, how can you talk about Ukraine with what's going on in Gaza? You guys can't talk to us, you guys being the West, you guys can't talk to us about international rule of law or human rights ever again. We don't want to know. Is there still a place for values-based international rule of law, or is it now purely transactional? And have we been trying to dress up a value-based international rule of law that's applied without fear or favour, even to our allies, as something that in reality is far more transactional?
So I think there's truth in all of that, but I think the problem is now different. So I think we've reached a point in the evolution of our planet where we in the West, and let's take 500 million people who live in Europe, are quite used to the idea, almost in quite an arrogant way, of asserting how the world works and asserting that on other people and saying, you'll be better off if you live like us. And that has sometimes meant, well, you might be, but we definitely will be better off if you follow our way. And that hasn't worked brilliantly, and the outcomes in Iraq and Afghanistan and what we're seeing in Ukraine and Gaza have all fed that sense. And that makes it difficult in exactly as you've described it. And I think I would want to look at it differently now, that from a European perspective, we have a choice to make in a world dominated by existential challenges, this combination of great power confrontation, population growth, climate change, and the shock of the digital age. This is a combination of risk we've never had to manage before. And in our own European interests, we are going to have to work out what's important to us And then we're going to have to refine the way of standing up for those interests, including our values, and putting them as a proposition to people. Or otherwise we're just going to be swept aside by people who just ignore us on the basis of mixed past performance, or because they're attached to alternative ways of thinking about the world which the autocratic capitalists will promote. And that has a seductive efficiency about it which democracy sometimes lacks. But if we're really having a conversation about how does Europe, attached I think still to the US, I very much hope so, find a path that's about our security, our prosperity, our values, then it is necessary to be in places like the Middle East and make that proposition and do it in a way that is about cooperation, not compulsion, and about creating a consensus that there is a lot in this. The durability of democracy seems to be a really good thing, even if there are many different ways of doing a democracy. And we should recognise that Europe still carries this phenomenal soft power in terms of innovation, industry, culture, institutions, education, sport, TV even. So we shouldn't take counsel of our fears, but because we became used to assuming the world will leave us alone or just agree with us, we've lost the art of being effective in asserting our interests. And in many ways we've been swept aside by less fettered, wealthier, often Chinese and Russian-led interventions, which aren't to the greater benefit of the people who receive these interventions, and they're definitely not to our benefit. So I think we need an internal conversation about how we usefully connect to places like the Middle East in a way that serves their interests as well as ours, and recognise that if there was a whiff of cultural or economic or military imperialism in the past, we don't need to do that again.
Sir Richard Barrons, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.